One might say that there's not the world's biggest rush to get Velarde, Sandberg, and Connor signed, but what's taking so long for the Jets to take care of business? Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
Your Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at AgeLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are chatting a little bit about the offseason so far, some recent trade stuff that has popped up, and where the Jets are in all of their contract negotiations. It is obviously a big moment for this summer where Winnipeg has 2 RFAs to get done, and they also have a looming contract year for one of their biggest forwards that might really shape kind of the future direction of this Jets team. And I've seen a lot of back and forth on social media recently about whether or not Kyle Connor should be extended, what happens if he doesn't want to stay. It is a very interesting question, and one that I think is going to start to become a little more common the longer that this whole negotiation takes. Not that I'm really seeing it as Connor being at risk of not signing with the Jets, but, if there comes to a point where he feels he's ready to make a change, it could really reshape how this Jets team goes forward. But before we dive into all of that, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. So let's get it out of the way, right? The Jets have 3 major free agents that are either coming up for renewal right now or are about to in about a year. And the biggest of all 3 of these is Kyle Connor. Now, Kyle Connor's deal is one that could really reshape the entire franchise, for better or for worse. In my mind, I think, the biggest problem with KFC is that it's hard to know if the version that we got this past year is the one that we're going to have going forward. If it is, I don't think you're as worried about, a $12 million extension. But if it's not, then you have a very, very expensive contract that as soon as it gets inked, it is a very big investment that may not give you the kind of value you're hoping for. Connor obviously does shoot a lot, and he is a pretty prolific goal scorer, but one of the biggest challenges with the Jets is that because he wants to play with Scheifele, it very much restricts how the Jets build their top 9. And I see a lot of people talking about the top line as being one of the best in the league, and you've heard me talk about in the past that the top line isn't actually all that prolific compared to a lot of other ones. It just plays a lot together, so it naturally scores a lot of points. But if you look at how they've played and how they've scored over their lifespan, you start to realize that they're a little more middle of the pack, which is not the worst thing, but it's not really great for the Jets when Winnipeg kind of needs to split up a lot more of their offense and win by committee. That makes it naturally a lot harder to get offense across the board when you stack so much of the talent on one line. And I think Scheifele honestly can do it by himself. He's such a great finisher. He's one of the best shooters on this team. And so it would honestly make more sense to get Connor to a different line and really spread the wealth. But because of how the Jets are really built, KFC and Scheifele have sort of been conjoined at the hip. It's really a shame because I think it just limits so much of what the Jets could do, and it honestly makes it really hard to, think about a contract extension when that's going to not only reshape Winnipeg's salary structure, but also limit how the Jets can build their roster up and down the lineup. So let's think about 2 things, right? If he does come back, it is going to be the biggest contract the Jets have ever handed out. I struggle to see anything less than $12 million. I think the Jets would have to pony that up, and it would make, the next couple of years very interesting because the Jets might not really be able to do a lot else if they still operate by an internal cap. Now, this is, by and large speculation at this point, but if the Jets do decide to not max out the expenditures and kind of keep salary cap that 90-95 mil over the next few years, that's going to make it a little bit difficult for Winnipeg to really compete for either big free agents or big extensions. Now, thankfully, we don't really have that many that are coming up that are going to be super critical. Hellebuck and Scheifele locking up has already solved the problem for those two. But, you've got Morrissey in a couple of years. You've got a lot of other free agents kind of in those mixed areas. You've got Perfetti at some point coming up. So there's a lot to sort out for the longer term. And Connor coming back would certainly lock up a major piece, but also it's expensive. And it kind of makes you wonder if, it wouldn't make more sense to try and spread that money out across the lineup. The Jets aren't really built to be, a top six sort of team, and yet that's how they see themselves. And so I think in my mind, it has always kind of limited the potential playoff ability of the squad once you start realizing how often the Jets maybe struggle with more of their lineup matchups than you realize. If Connor doesn't want to come back and he's thinking it's time for a change of scenery, then this year has to be the year that he gets traded. Now, again, I think this is extremely unlikely, and I haven't really given this that much thought, but if KFC decides it's time for a change of scenery, I could see him being one of the most valued trade assets out there. And because he has a very positive reputation, people love the flashy stuff that he does, and he scores a ton of points, I have to imagine teams would be lining up out the door to give the Jets a pretty impressive trade package. I think you could get quite a few futures, probably a younger roster player, and really reshape how the Jets' top nine is. It'll be a moment of pain for the franchise, and I think it would probably lead towards, maybe a year where you struggle to make the playoffs, maybe even 2 years. But I think the longer-term benefits would become very apparent very quickly. So, it's one of those very tricky things, right? I see a lot of people talking about how do you replace a guy like KFC? And I don't think that you do. I think it's more about how you restructure your whole top nine. Your fourth line's whatever, but your top nine being more balanced across the board, having more ability to drive zone offense and control would really be a big boom. All of this to say that this KFC deal might be why the Jets are taking some time to try and figure out what to do with Sandberg and Vilardi. Whether KFC comes back or not, I think really impacts so many other things downstream, and it forces the Jets to sort of rerun the numbers on these contracts. Now, Sandberg, I don't really worry about. He's coming back one way or another, and it's going to be long-term. I really don't see a reason for him not to, and he wants to sign long-term, so not worried about that. Vilardi is a little more up in the air. That one I still don't quite have a firm feeling on, but the KFC decision might be why everything is taking a bit of time. The Jets kind of have to have a contract for him by the start of the season if he's coming back. I don't think you can start the year without him having, a locked up, firmed up contract unless something really changes and he wants to test new waters. Again, I just can't see that happening. It would be shocking to me because it feels like he's pretty happy in Winnipeg and we've never heard that he wants out, but maybe he feels that this isn't quite the direction that he wants to go. So going to be a very interesting next few weeks. I'm hoping that we at least hear something about Sandberg and Vilardi here pretty soon. KFC, though, might be kind of the linchpin behind all of these extensions. And once that one is done, it starts to open up other doors. It's been a few weeks since we last even heard rumors about KFC, so I wouldn't stress about it too much right now, but the closer we get to August, the more you start to wonder what exactly is going on with some of these deals. So hopefully the Jets get it squared away. They get them either locked up or the future sort of sorted out pretty quickly here. All of this can really change how we look at the Jets going forward. Speaking of which, though, there have been some other players recently who have started popping up in trade rumors, and one of them just popped up today. Apparently he wants out of Columbus. Yegor Chinakhov might be a guy the Jets should really be calling about, especially since the Jets have tons of assets they can use to exchange for a guy who might be a little more on the disgruntled side. We'll chat about why the Jets should go for this coming right up. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than just a budgeting app, though. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So, not just managing your money, you're actually building wealth. Now, if you've ever wondered how much you're spending on subscriptions and streaming services, you might be surprised when you load up Monarch Money and find out you have paid way more than you ever thought possible. Maybe you've got a partner or a spouse and you both have all these services you don't really need. Monarch Money can help highlight all of these expenditures and help you save money and set goals together. So you're always on the same page and you can help cut back on things you really don't need. It's great, it's convenient, it's all in one app, and you can take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about some interesting trade stuff that's ongoing right now. Obviously, the offseason has slowed a little bit since the start of free agency, but we have had a couple of deals in between. We've had some stuff pop up, and there's been a recent big rumor that I think really should be something the Jets invest. Now, this port of call would be sort of funny because it's one the Jets have gone to before, but it would be Columbus. Yegor Chinakhov apparently has asked for a trade, and Chinakhov is, in my mind, the exact kind of profile of player that the Jets really need to target. I know that oftentimes we look at sort of disgruntled players, and I think the Jets tend to get a little bit of maybe a cold feet sort of situation. We know that the Jets don't really make a lot of big trades to begin with, right? Let alone for players who want out with their respective teams. We only really see this when the Jets need to trade their own guy who's disgruntled, and they've got to send him somewhere that's looking for maybe a similar sort of swap. Now, say for the last two trades the Jets have done this, it actually worked out pretty well, right? And what Winnipeg got back in return were not players who were necessarily looking for a change of scenery. I don't really get the sense that Velarde, Iafallo, Kupari, or Yegor were necessarily eager to leave their franchises. Kupari maybe a little bit just because I think he probably felt like LA sort of capped his development, but I think we all saw that he was sort of what he was at his stage of his career. With a guy like Chinakhov, it's a little bit different, right? Yegor has apparently felt like, the coaching staff he doesn't really get along with, doesn't seem to be a big Evason fan, and Evason doesn't really seem to be a big fan of him either. And you look at his recent record and you might feel like it's not that impressive. And I get the skepticism, but under the surface, there's a lot to like in his sort of underlying fancy stats profile. And with a guy who's a young 24-year-old winger on a team that has historically really struggled to create offense, he's put up okay numbers. Last year, before this past season, he had 29 points in 53 games. This year, he had 15 and 30. He had, a bit of an injury spell recently that's kind of hampered a lot of his season. And so there is a bit of risk with him, but he's one of those very interesting players where he also said he'd be willing to play this season out, right? If there's not really a trade partner that makes sense, Chinakhov will 100%, commit to the Blue Jackets. He's going to show up to camp. He's not going to hold out. So in Columbus's mind, there's not really urgency to do this deal. But for the Jets, right? Winnipeg just lost one of their biggest offensive wingers, and a guy who's playing roughly comparable minutes and could bring some really solid two-way play, which Chinakhov surprisingly does. He's got a pretty decent defensive impact while also being a reasonably talented scorer. I think that there's an intriguing fit there. Now, Columbus is probably looking to bring in some roster talent, so that does kind of pose a little bit of a challenge. The Jets really have more futures than anything, and the kind of stuff that Columbus would probably be asking for, the Jets probably aren't that inclined to give up. But in my mind, if you're looking to maybe leverage some of those futures and stuff that you've got, maybe a Barlow would make sense in this kind of deal, right? You swap Barlow, maybe you move some sort of a roster player or something, one-year depth guys, maybe you move a pick or something along with it. I think it wouldn't be the worst to reallocate some of that skill across the Jets lineup, because when you look at Winnipeg's roster, right, we are on the older side. We're on the slower side now coming into the season, and we haven't really seen a replacement for Ehlers lined up. And I'm not sitting here saying that Chinakhov is going to do that, but I think he's also a very interesting gamble. When you look at these sort of underlying profiles, you look at how he's done for Columbus, and you look at players who have kind of come from sort of similar issues, right? Capo Caco being a recent example. It's kind of easy to see them thriving on a much stronger team. And I think if he were to come to Winnipeg, you'd be looking at a more balanced squad, right? Winnipeg would be a more supportive environment. This team has a really strong defensive structure. And, the Jets, quite frankly, need a boost at 5v5. They're a solid team when it comes to even strength play, but probably not as much as people are inclined to believe. So, in my mind, I feel like this is an interesting punt. Um, Again, Columbus is not necessarily rushing to do this. And Chinakhov himself saying that he's happy to report, to camp and play out the season if it takes that long, kind of already makes it harder to make this deal happen. And I don't quite know how he would feel personally about moving towards Winnipeg, but he would have, at least a fellow compatriot in Chibrikov, which would be very interesting. He's not a small player. He's 6'1", 200 pounds. I think that there's some decent size there, and he's got a pretty responsible two-way game. I think Arniel would actually really like him. I think that he could do some really good work for the Jets, and he doesn't have hands of stone. So for me, this is a very interesting situation and one that I would like the Jets to keep an eye on. Again, I think this is where Winnipeg can really make out like bandits. Oftentimes, as we're moving towards this future where revenue and the cap continue to rise, it's going to put the Jets in a really tough spot. Winnipeg is not a big free market destination or big free agent, big open market destination. We know that, right? We know that a lot of players put Winnipeg on their no trade clauses. And so when you have an opportunity to maybe pluck a young forward who's looking for a new change of scenery and a new challenge, I feel like you really should start to investigate these routes more. It can help you supplement your middle six. It can give you some more scoring punch, and you might just find a real gem hidden amongst, what is proverbially a bunch of coal. And the Jackets did pretty well this year, but it's not like their offense was all that impressive. So a guy like Chinakhov, who has traditionally done pretty decently the last few years and really just had an unfortunate injury that held him out this season, I think is a really interesting bet. At worst, he put up half a point per game in the season, which is really not that bad. You prorate that for the entire year. What? You're looking at a 40 to 45 point guy. I could see that easily helping Winnipeg out, especially for a team that, again, is going to be older, going to be slower, and is going to have probably some level of trouble creating more 5v5 offense. Probably less so during the regular season, but during the playoffs, certainly a little bit of a concern. So keep an eye out on that situation. Not necessarily one that I would expect the Jets to be imminently on, but maybe if the price is right and, Columbus is willing to come back to the table on something like this after we've dealt with them before on the Dubois-Liney thing, maybe we can sort of rekindle some of those old sparks, and this time we bring in the guy who wants the change of scenery. What would be going the other way? Well, a little bit harder to figure out, but if the Jets could maybe parlay a Barlow or something who's kind of on the cusp of making the NHL, and in my mind might actually be sort of in that Boone Jenner mold, with a lot of leadership qualities and big in the room sort of stuff, maybe the Blue Jackets would really be down for that, and it might make sense for both teams. Winnipeg needs more immediate help. Barlow has some cosmetic things that maybe make him less suited to, elite NHL play, but he can still play a role in Columbus and be a guy that, that team sort of builds around as far as that locker room personality is concerned. So hopefully, the Jets are investigating stuff like this. I feel like, I don't necessarily need them to swing for like the biggest trade ever, but if they can find a way to really improve the team at a low cost, I think that would be really ideal. We did also see today that Dakota Joshua has gone to Toronto for a 4th-round pick. Pretty low, but at this point it was a bit of a cap dump. This season didn't really go super well for him, and it's a little bit of a shame. He just signed a 4-year deal in Vancouver, so interesting to see some of these depth cap dumps kind of get swapped around. But for the Maple Leafs, it's a nice gamble, right? Joshua had a pretty productive season prior, unfortunately had testicular cancer. Glad that he was able to beat it back for now and hope that that continues to be the case, right? That stuff can be really hard. As a Borussia Dortmund fan, one of our star strikers had to go through it a couple years ago, and, he's still kind of getting healthy again, really starting to build up and try and strengthen himself, and it seems like he might actually be coming back to Dortmund a new guy. So hopefully, Joshua can do the same if he's feeling some of those after effects. It's rough. It can be hard, and sometimes, you want your body to do something, and cancer, that time delay where the performance drop happens, it can be really hard to deal with. So rooting for him to do well in Toronto. Hope the Leafs fans love him. He's a really nice guy, and one of those deals that hopefully works out for everyone involved. Now, speaking of kind of all this stuff, and whether it's talking about acquisitions or disgruntled players, or maybe even the looming contract situation with KFC, I want to chat about what to look out for over the next few months. This is going to be a very interesting season from the Jets. One where I do expect a pretty noticeable step back, but maybe that's not for the worst. We'll chat about that coming right up. We've all been there, logging on early and waiting forever to see concert tickets go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. That's where Gametime comes in. Gametime makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever before. Prices actually drop as it gets closer to showtime, and you can save up to 60% off with their killer last-minute deals. I've used Gametime buying sports tickets, whether it was for Ravens playoff games or something like that. It was great because I actually got to see all of the prices up front with no hidden fees, and I could even see panoramic seat views, so I knew what I was paying for. It's great, it's convenient, and of course, you always have these zone deals and special savings to make sure that you're getting the best deal possible. So take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's show as we're just wrapping up with some thoughts on what to look for over the next couple of months and really for the season for the Jets. I think my biggest takeaway from the summer so far is that the Jets are sort of hedging their bets a little bit. It feels like Winnipeg is maybe holding back a bit. You look at the signings, you look at what they've done, a lot of it feels more like filling in gaps with, Band-Aid solutions rather than longer-term major signings or trades. Aside from Toews, right, could you really say that any of these contracts that they've handed out really improved the team? You've added depth guys, you've added some camp competition, but I wouldn't say that we're looking at anyone in particular who's going to be a major player. This Jets team doesn't feel like it has really moved forward off of what was a very, very successful President's Trophy season. So in my mind, I kind of think the Jets are looking at this upcoming year maybe in a way where they're not really upset if things don't go super well. They give themselves flexibility to make a move. They can add or they can subtract, and they seem to be comfortable doing either. If they subtract, it would be to try and get some futures and stuff and really flesh out this pool, right? I think the Jets are hoping in some ways that if things don't go well, that they end up with a really high pick. This year's draft is probably the one where if you have a rough season, it really is not the worst thing. Winnipeg is about to enter a new era of the NHL where there's going to be some have and have not kind of stuff, right? The big markets are going to be able to spend more. They're going to be able to bring in more revenue. And that's just not Winnipeg. It puts the Jets in a really tough position. But I think that there's the advantage of the draft being the way that it is, that if the Jets were to slip and fall, it's really not a bad outcome. We've talked a lot about the Jets needing to draft big game-breaking talent. So should it somehow happen that Winnipeg slips and falls, and I think it would take a lot for it to happen, but it's not unthinkable, again, I think that's one door where the Jets are preparing to maybe liquidate some of these cheap one-year deals they have for guys who are often moved at the trade deadline. Pearson, Nyquist, these are guys who are frequently traded. So keep an eye out for that. But if the Jets do well, this is where you could maybe rely on some of your young ELCs to fill in the gap. Obviously, Brad Lambert's probably one of the bigger X factors coming into the season. And so what I'm watching for him out of preseason is to see what his motivation is like. How hungry is he for an NHL spot? He spent the past couple of seasons with the Moose. After a very successful first year, this past year saw a bit of a step back, but I think that was really across the board. It wasn't just him that struggled, the whole team was bad. And so I don't know how much I really lean into it being his fault and how much I really feel like it is just the Moose not really being a particularly great squad. I don't really think that what happened with him is a fair reflection of his skill. But by the same token, you'd also really like him to take control and dominate. Now, being top 3 in team scoring, I think, is probably worth bearing in mind. But again, you haven't seen him maybe take that next step to where he's just, dominating and controlling play and making it impossible to keep him down. So that's what I hope for out of him from camp. And I'd also like to see how Arneal tries to react to a much slower team, right? This is going to be a heavier forechecking, slower squad. There's going to be, a lot more veterancy with the team, and how that sort of plays out with the team's approach towards generating 5v5 play, what happens with Toews. All of this is going to be a very sort of trial and error situation. We've had slow teams before, we've had older teams before, but this team really feels like, with the departure of Ehlers and sort of the acquisitions of guys who are definitely not Nick Ehlers, it's going to be a very different team than we've seen in some time. And it's why I kind of felt like the Jets were maybe looking at this summer as not the one to really go all in. I think Winnipeg saw what happened with the Panthers. They saw Dallas, which beat them, get absolutely glassed by the Oilers. And how do you think the Panthers and Oilers built their core? Sure, they made a lot of big trades, but the chief thing that they had was a strong foundation through the draft to build off of. Lindell and Barkov are major franchise cornerstones that were drafted. McDavid and Draisaitl and Bouchard drafted. So for the Jets, I wonder if they're starting to rethink how they've built their squad and if they're starting to prepare for a transition towards the future. And if that's really what they feel like this season's going to be, that sort of beginning of a retooling and a pivot, count me down for that. I think that that's a necessary move. I think the Jets have done really well hitting their current ceiling, but if they want to take that next step and become, a different sort of playoff team, maybe, a year of some struggles isn't the worst outcome. So this year could be a very, very interesting thing. If they do well enough to make the playoffs and, they're in a really good spot, they can certainly overhaul with the big trade deadline. And, we still have the specter of them making some sort of big splash. Maybe they go after a McTavish. Maybe they try for a Chinakhov. They have legitimate options to turn this team into a very different looking squad by the start of the season in October. So I wouldn't rule anything specifically out, but I do think that, it's nice that we have flexibility to figure it out, and there is still time to do so. Just keep an eye out for what happens with these contract extensions. That may have some bearing on what the Jets do afterwards, and hopefully it is all to make the Jets a much better team over the next couple of seasons. But curious to know how you feel about this. What do you think of the offseason so far? I've asked this question a little bit recently, but would love to get your thoughts on where you think the Jets should go. Are you looking more for a tank? Do you feel like if they slip into maybe like a top 15 draft selection, that's a failure of the summer and season? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.